All right, welcome back to class. This is going to be our fourth video. I'm going to try to wrap up what we say about the survey review at this point. A couple more structures to nail down, particularization and generalization. These are related, and actually summarization. I'm going to put all three of these up here. Particularization, generalization, and summarization. These all have to do with texts that make very general statements that essentially pull together the details that either come before it or after it. Okay, particularization is a way of organizing literature in which the author starts off with a broad statement, a general statement, and then moves to particulars. So this goes from the general to the particular. Let me give you a really easy example from Matthew's Gospel. Think about Matthew chapter 6. That's the place where the Lord's Prayer is. In the first 18 verses, it starts off, beware that you show off your righteousness before people. Right? And so then Jesus gives three examples of that. He gives the example of giving alms to the poor, of praying, and of fasting in those cases. And so the principle is don't show off your acts of righteousness before people, because that's going to be a reward. And so what exactly does that look like? Well, he gives them three particular examples. So again, almsgiving, prayer, and fasting as the examples of that. Now, that's particularization. Or you can look at the text about relationships in say Ephesians, where it says, submit yourselves to one another. That's a general statement, and then it's within that context that Paul then talks about the relationships between men and women, between children and parents, and between slaves and masters. But the key, and this is the key to reading those texts, is to see that it assumes from that general statement a mutual submission up front. That's vital. It's general to particular. Now, generalization and summarization are similar. That's where they give the particulars and then make a broad statement that sums things up. So an example of that would be how the book of 1 John is structured. You go all the way through 1 John, then it ends with this statement, little children, keep yourselves from idols, which suggests that that whole book then is about idolatry. You might not have known it, but then it ends with that general statement. A summarization would be is then a similar generalization, but it's a much more detailed summary. An example of that would be maybe Acts 1:8, where it talks about how in the book of Acts the gospel is going to move from Jerusalem to the next chunk to the next chunk. That's a potential example of a summarization. It's a little fishy between those two pieces, but one of the keys I want you to see is particularization is general to particular. Generalization, summarization is going to be the particulars to a general. That's what generalization is going to be. And summarization can be examples of either one of those, but where the general statement is much more specific. We don't want to get hung up on things. And by the way, when we're doing all the structures, and now we have gotten through all the structures, it's not as much or as important to always get the labeling right. Now, obviously, we use this labeling to have a vocabulary that we can talk to each other about what we found. But it's more important to actually see what's happening than to always be able to describe it properly. So sometimes you're going to be doing your work, and you'll find things, and you may label something, but whatever you label, make sure that you give content. So on your assignments, you're not just going to write structures, you're going to give verses that illustrate the structures and describe briefly what it is that you mean by this structure. This is vital, so it's at least at minimum, so when I look at your work, I can understand where you're coming from, especially if I'm like, I'm not sure that that's there, but then I read and I'm like, oh, I see. They're seeing this, they just maybe called it something a little bit different than what I called it. So make sure that you use the labels, but then give content, including verse references and a little bit of detail. So you want to write 2, 3, 4 sentences that describe what it is that you're seeing with each one of these structures. Okay. Okay, that's that step. The next steps to finish out your survey, and I'll be able to wrap this up pretty quick. After we found the structure, and again, the structure is the main units, subunits, and then a description of the structural relationships. The next thing we want to do is ask questions. Now, if you look at the structure sheet again, each of the structures has a set of sample questions, okay? And we're asking 3 different kinds of questions. You read about these in the book. There's definitional questions that are essentially, you know, what is involved in, what is the meaning of, what's here, essentially. And you can look at each of the structures that I have laid out. You want to ask a set of definitional questions for each structure. You're then going to want to ask rational questions. That's the why question. And then you're going to want to ask implicational question. What are the implications, or simply implications with a question mark? So there's definitional, the what, rational, the why, implicational, which is implications. So if you look at contrast, the questions I have there, what specifically is being contrasted, what's involved in each element of the contrast. Those are the definitional questions. The rationals, why are these differences being stressed? And then the implicational is, what are the implications? So for every structure, you want to ask all 3 types of questions. Now, you can put some of the content from the text into those questions, but those are sample questions to give you a basis for writing your own questions. And again, a lot of this class is to practice asking the right questions. Questions are the key to guide us to the meaning of a passage. Okay, so for each structure, make sure you're asking all 3 types of questions. So that means then, if you find 3 different structural relationships, you're going to have 3 different sets of questions. And each of those 3 sets of questions are going to have at least 3 questions: a definitional question, a rational question, and an implicational question. Okay, then the next step is to have and locate the strategic area. And again, what's the strategic area? Think about the map. What part of the map looks like it's most significant to study? And so now you're going to link this to structure. So again, questions are linked to the structures. The strategic areas are going to be linked to the structure. For each structure that you've identified, pick a smaller section. So like if you're just doing a paragraph, it's probably a verse. You're talking about a key verse. If you're doing a chapter, it's going to be maybe a paragraph or part of a paragraph. But what part of the whole would be strategic for best understanding each of the structures that you've identified? So if you find a climax, for example, what's the most logical part of the whole to call a strategic area? It would be the actual climactic section. If you find a particularization, you know, it's probably the general statement would be the most significant part. If it's a pivot, it's that pivotal section. So again, some of the structures have obvious places. Other ones, like cause and effect, you have to decide what part of the cause is the most significant or what part of the effect, and just pick one. But again, the key thing I want you to hear, make sure you hear me say this, your questions go back to your structures, and your strategic area goes back to the structures. You don't pick a strategic area just because you like a verse that you've studied. You pick the strategic area based on how the author has structured the material, so you're liking what the author thinks is the most significant, because if we believe in inspiration, what the author thinks is most significant is what God thinks is most significant. Make sense? Okay. Then you make a couple other fairly easy observations. On these short surveys, what you want to do is then talk about what literary type are we dealing with. Is it a narrative? Is it a genealogy? Is it a parable? Is it more hortatory literature, like or epistolary literature? You know, make a label. Is it poetry? Is it prophecy? Is it apocalyptic? Those are options that we have to describe the text. And then make an atmospheric observation. In other words, what's the tone? If you're going to take 2 or 3 words that you're going to describe the text, what would you say? You know, like if you take like Psalm 150, where it ends up, everything that has breath, praise the Lord. I'm going to say that the atmosphere there is praise, joy, worship. right? Does that make sense? And maybe Psalm 22, desperation. All right, so pick some words that you can use to describe the whole, because that just gives you a little mark at the survey, and at the end of the day, if the text seems to be kind of dark or foreboding, your interpretation ought to go along those lines. Whereas if it's really happy, it should be happy and not something depressing. And then the last thing you can do is have a section of miscellaneous notes. Anything that you think is important or that you want to remember about the text but doesn't fit into one of these other elements, put it there. Again, that's a quick overview of how to do a survey. You can watch these videos over, or you can go back and read those sections of the book. But this is just to give you some frameworks as you begin to do your own surveys in this class. And as always, I welcome any questions that you would have.